Inevitable that Augustia's daily routine in madness should fall into a pattern, however irregular, because mere living imposes its own cycle of ingestion and excretion, of sleep and awakening. He eventually accustomed or resigned himself to the pattern of his days, to the insomnia and the relief from it that graced him but fitfully, to the mosquitoes that dragged him out of sleep. He often exercised on the veranda in the half light of dawn. If stiff with lack of sleep, he did his push ups and his spot running in the heat of his room before breakfast, while Digambar squatted outside the closed door, lazily marveling at Augustia's foolishness in exerting himself so much more than was necessary. But he exercised regularly. It was a fragment from his old life, and it somehow seemed to imbue the day with with a little meaning. Vasant brought him tea between 6 and 9. Sometime the precise time every day depended on when he, Vasant, pushed himself out of bed to fetch the milk. Lives were led very leisurely in Madna. Agastya never complained, for guessing when Vasant would bring him his tea became part of the larger game of identifying movements in the outside world through sound. He would lie in bed, stare at the ceiling through the mosquito net, feel the breeze from the window turn warm, and say to himself, "Yes, that mad chatter is Vasant's children going to school. And that cycle is that senile bugger coming to clean the toilets. That mysterious thump is probably Shankar falling off his bed in a drunken stupor. That clang is perhaps Vasant and tea." Some mornings, if the heat hadn't begun, he would take a chair out to the veranda and in a daze watch the trains screech by to Delhi. He noticed the colors on the trains, orange and cream, mustard yellow and green, and decided that that would be a nice job, deciding color schemes for trains. He wondered at the immensity of the Indian railways, millions of people traveling thousands of kilometers every day. Why they did so baffled him. On less calm mornings, he would think about his situation and his job, why he wasn't settling down, whether his sense of dislocation was only temporary or whether it was a warning signal. But there was nothing specific that he wanted to do, no other job, and then with a smile he would retort, "Yes, there was. Design color schemes for trains. Be a domesticated male stray dog, or like Madan, even half wish to be murdered." "It's all over then," Madan had reasoned with razor edge logic, "and without your having done anything for it. Wonderful." Digambar, his head swathed in a red towel, would arrive sometime between 7 and 10. Agastya saw no reason for fixing his time either. He washed Agastya's clothes, did the bed and the room in about 6 minutes, and then settled down outside to somnolence. Sometimes Agastya also envied him. Breakfast from Vasant was unavoidable, so Agastya experimented with it. Bread, soft boiled egg, sliced tomato, sliced boiled potato, tea, and his tin of condensed milk, which was kept in the rest house fridge, at the whole of which he sucked at the end of breakfast to get rid of the taste of all that had preceded it. He thought that he was being scientific about his food and evading Vasant's cooking to the extent possible. All that actually happened was that he felt ravenous at 11. Food became very important in Madna, and he was soon to encourage and concentrate on his stomach pangs. For hunger was evidence of one's good health, and thinking about eating itself gave him something to do. It made him calculate which houses in Madna he could attack for lunches and dinners, and if compelled to eat Vasant's garbage, then the menu for it. A very few days in the district and he was sick, even scared of abstract thought. The problem of food gave him something concrete for cogitation. Lying on the bed, staring blankly up at the ceiling, his most characteristic position for all the months, he would ask himself where his next meal was coming from, and laugh helplessly at the cliched question. Before Madna, he had always taken food for granted, like air. In his college days, whenever the hostel fare had been inedible, but never like Vasant's creations, they had always gone out to some daba. Now he did hope that there were places in Madna where one could eat cheaply, but he didn't have the will to hunt for them, and consequently thought maybe he had to consider heterogeneity of taste, and maybe all over the town he would get only chewing gum chapatis. Mrs. Shrivastov provided the largest number of meals that year. Otherwise, while roaming through various government offices trying to learn the complexities of administration, he would surprise various officers by taking them up on their casual invitations. It was a good game, and he enjoyed it, while maintaining what Menon had called the dignity of office, to extract an invitation to dinner, and to seem to accept reluctantly, but with grace, saying that he would be honored, and actually feeling triumphant, while implying that the honor would be the host's. When Mrs. Shrivastov also asked why he didn't shift to a flat and learn to cook for himself, it was difficult to answer. Because scrounging is challenging and greater fun. And in a perverse way, Vasant's food was exciting, full of hazards concocted to unsettle boredom. So was his ostensibly boiled water. Let the water begin to boil, then let the water remain on the fire boiling for about 10 minutes, and then switch off the gas. Boiling for 10 minutes means counting 10 minutes after the water begins to boil, not leaving the water on the gas for 10 minutes. He said words like these to Vasant slowly and carefully, as to an obstinate and demented child, almost every day, but in all those months he was never sure whether he really drank boiled water at the rest house. Whenever Vasant brought the jug, he would ask, "Is it boiled?" And Vasant would nod, sometimes dip his finger and say, "It's hot." Defeated and amused, Augustia solved his doubt by drinking water everywhere he went and patted his flat, hard stomach in the mirror in compliment. Once, out of boredom, he had wanted to go to the kitchen to demonstrate the boiling of water for drinking. He couldn't. Vasant at first didn't understand and then seemed to pretend not to. Then he nodded his head vigorously, closing his eyes with each nod, and moved away. Augustia went after him, but Vasant stopped him with an outstretched arm and an open Buddha-like palm. Augustia said, "Fuck you," to his back. Vasant returned with a kerosene stove which he placed on the veranda floor. Augustia said, "Yes, yes," and sent him away, thinking, maybe he doesn't want me to see his kitchen, the mire out of which my meals emerge. And lunch, which was really a second breakfast, also had its contingent perils, but they were sometimes as engrossing as a Sunday paper chess problem. Once, while bringing the tray in, Vasant stumbled and upset the milk all over the rest of the food. He put the tray down on the table. Augustia retrieved the slices of potato and tomato from the milk. "I'll go get another glass of milk." "Here, take the tray with you." Vasant picked it up, a plate of milk in a tray of milk. He returned a few minutes later with a glass of hot milk with black dots in it. "What's that?" "Tea leaves," said Vasant, and removed them with his left index finger. It could have been paper from the potato. It could have been pepper from the potato. Augustia suspected that Vasant had just filled another glass with the milk from the tray and the plate. He himself would have done the same. Then his cerebrations began. But the milk was hot. Well, Vasant had just heated it again. Perhaps I should ask him. But if the milk is actually fresh, with just a few tea leaves from the saucepan in it, then my suspicion will offend him and give him ideas. He cooks your food. He could make you eat anything. And remember that Vasant looks mad anyway, with his gray stubble and the tumor above his right collarbone. Augustia left the tray to discuss the matter with the mirror. "Now, you can't yell at Vasant because he might just feed you his dirds. Actually, anyone who has a servant is completely at his mercy. His aunt in Calcutta, who had disapproved the most of his father's marrying a Goan, said all the time, perhaps he should sneak up on Vasant one day, with stealth, in his running shoes. But if he was seen, it would be very difficult to explain. Then he returned to the tray and dipped his finger in the milk too, to see how it felt. On most days, the jeep came for him between 11 and 12. Before its arrival, there was time enough to smoke some marijuana, often against his will. On some mornings, he didn't really want to. On those mornings, he would go over to the mirror, absent-mindedly examine his beard, turn sideways, and out of the corner of his eye try to look at his profile, an old habit, and ask his reflection why he should smoke, and anyway, why he should smoke so much. Because there wasn't much else to do, he would answer, unless he wanted to masturbate. Sometimes he did both, laughing at the determined entry in his diary of the first day and at the memory of Madan and their shared belief that fucking someone else was less satisfying and more tiresome than fucking your fist. There wasn't much else to do. Reading was impossible, with his mind in its state of quiet tumult. And the titles that had accompanied him from Calcutta and Delhi were almost laughable in their remoteness. Two Bengali novels, Pather Panchali and Gora, neither of which could hold him because the problems of their protagonist were almost unapproachable. He always wanted something with immediacy. Pulkatatu had been scathing about this too expectedly when Agastya read them the first time. Two seminal novels in your language and you can't even begin to appreciate them. One literary curiosity, an English translation of the Ramayana by an American who, he gathered from the introduction, seemed to have chatted often with Hanuman in the Himalayas, and a copy of Marcus Aurelius, his father's present on his last birthday. Its first page said in Bengali, "To Ogu, on turning 24, hoping he makes you wise." Sometimes before the jeep arrived, he could concentrate on a few lines, especially when slightly stoned. The meditations turned out to be very incongruously, he thought, his only reading. The passages were generally short, so he wasn't asked to think for more than a few lines at a go. In those months, he grew to like immensely this wise, sad Roman. Marcus immediately made him feel better because Marcus seemed to have more problems than anyone else. Not the soul-squashing problems of being poor, but the exhilarating, abstract problems of one immersed wholly in his self. Earlier, Agastya would have perhaps pooh-poohed him. Life was to be enjoyed, not endured. But in Madna, he could not dare say such a facile thing. Still, occasionally, he would say to the page, "Seize the day, boy," and then smile. Imagine calling Marcus Aurelius boy. Yet again, the absurd, never far from him, would assail him. Perhaps Marcus's meditations weren't really genuine. He could easily have whipped off a few on the marble writing table beside his couch while a beautiful Roman adolescent, exuding from behind his ears and his wrists the perfumes from the ports of Deccan, India, which would have been a mere few hundred kilometers away from the spot where, 1600 years after Marcus, a tribal would found a kingdom and call it Madna, sucked him off, or while he was ejaculating into a guest's wine goblet, muttering Quo vadis to the spirit of Caligula. Like Marcus, he kept a desultory diary that year, for like Marcus, he meditated, but in the oddest of situations, while exercising, for instance. His exercise took about 20 minutes, and he quite enjoyed it, after he had somehow coerced himself to begin. I don't see a single person in government who looks in shape. I don't want to be like them, he would say as he lunged for a push-up. But the fad was Western, wasn't it? A Western fad to try to remain young. He would stop, pant, rush to his diary and note, "Is it a Western fad to try and remain young? Nira keeps saying so. Neera, his friend in Calcutta, did often say that the West worships youth. When they begin looking old, they get themselves facelifts. But we in India are equally stupid, worshipping age. Neera herself was fat and lazy. He would return to his push ups with his mind in chaos. He would again stop at his 17th push up and watch drops of sweat fall on the carpet. Was it wrong to exercise and try to remain fit and young? An ant would perhaps scurry across the damp disks of sweat on the carpet. Well, did or didn't the ant feel the wet beneath its feet? Did an ant have feet? But if it didn't, then what did its legs end in? Just dots? Get on with the push ups, boy, but the strength would have left his mind. In his diary, he would note, NB Nera is a Marxist and talks a lot of shit. And below it, have you ever thought how embarrassing it would be if someone found out that you kept a diary? But not all the entries in his diary were frivolous. Of course, it was the seriously intended entries that he was more embarrassed about. Marcus Aurelius indirectly taught him the magic of catharsis, that writing assisted thought and clarity of mind, that it was good to be rational. The littlest things became significant, that a pen could move across a page and that its trail, as it were, could make sense. Suddenly, this seemed magical. A squiggle and a curve, they hold meaning. He wrote, "What are your problems?" and laughed. God, there were so many, and all so totally vague, but analysis helped or seemed to help. That was why it was good to be rational. The driver of the jeep that came for Augustia in the mornings was usually unable to differentiate one district office from another. So, for almost an hour on some of the good days, he would drive Augustia around the town just trying to locate an office of the district inspector of land records, say, or of the divisional forest officer. On the good days, it was a strange and exhilarating adventure racing down the narrow streets of an unknown town, braking dangerously to ask panwalas and cobblers, searching half-heartedly for some office. Many hadn't heard of the place they wanted. Some directed them wrongly. Some were emphatic that the place just didn't exist. Looking at the people the driver asked, Augustia realized how little he knew of the real Madina beyond its offices. And the ride itself was lulling. It was soporific to be mindlessly shunted about in a vehicle, to succumb to the marijuana, the heat, the rhythm, and roar of the jeep. Sometimes, when they finally reached the office on the schedule for that day, they would find that the officer was absent, was touring, was on leave. Sometimes he would be there but with no idea of what he was to do with or say to Augustia. Sometimes Augustia's lack of interest was far outmatched by the officer's. Augustia would sit beside him and look around at the decaying walls and the leaking water cooler in the corner, the fading map on the wall and the government calendar. The officer would ask a few questions. Augustia would lie without restraint. Then he would be obliged to ask questions in return. When he felt that he knew enough about that office to lie to the collector that same evening about what he had learned that day, he would announce that he ought to return to the rest house for lunch and add, with a smile, that it would be just too hot in the afternoon to return. The officer would beam his complete agreement. Sometimes he wanted to complain to Sheriff that no one was teaching him anything, but never did, because he felt that the fault might be his, that he would be reproached for his lack of interest, an accusation that he would be unable to deny. He did learn a little in some offices, not about the intricacies of administration, but broadly about the ways of the wider world. The district inspector of land records told him, for instance, that every inch of India was plotted on some map or other. Every inch? He was somehow pleased and proud. Of course, sir. So much of government work depends on land records. Who owns what lands, when land was transferred or inherited. If government is to acquire land for something or the other, to build a dam or a thermal power station, we have to have proper land records. No, to decide whom to pay compensation to. After all, land is everyone's most important asset. The inspector was a worn, apologetic man. He sat in a small, noisy room in an alley above a shop that sold plastic mugs and buckets and ran, on the side, a video library. He traveled on an old bicycle. In the office, we have maps of the entire district. We'll show you a few. The maps came in with tea. The inspector drank from his saucer. The maps were on a parchment or tracing paper, and the inspector unrolled them reverentially over the books on his table. The books themselves fascinated Augustia. City Survey Manual, Manual of Rules and Standing Orders relating to land records, establishments. Someone somewhere actually wrote such things, and there were people in this world who consulted these every day. The older maps were in English, but still completely indecipherable. They all showed areas apportioned in a variety of geometric shapes, each with a number. Why, thought Augustia, children could play games on these maps and try and capture these squares and hexagrams through speed or deceit or both, and assign different values for each shape. Land is important everywhere. All kinds of land, said the inspector. But you have lived in the cities. There you cannot sense the importance of agricultural land. It's the real wealth. Each of these squares and hexagrams could be worth lakhs. The inspector had been sitting in that one chair for years. Every day he examined maps and their attendant ledgers and documents, drank his tea from a saucer to the noises from outside of cars and rickshaws and altercations. When he wanted to urinate, he went downstairs to some hole behind the shop. On rare afternoons, Shrivastov summoned Augustia to the collectorate for some meeting or other. Otherwise, on most days, he stayed in his room. He would spend some of the afternoon, sometimes with Shankar, drinking, lying, listening to him on Madna, art, Tamzi. Don't you ever go to the office, Shankar Sab? Speak for yourself, Sen Sab, and neighs of joy. We are very similar, I tell you, governed by Shani and loved by Jagadamba. We have similar habits. He lifted up his glass and neighed again. Neither goes to office after lunch, and similar views. We hate office and prefer the life outside. Similar tastes for music, similar situations. We have both been banished in Madna. His afternoons stretched from his lunch to whenever he asked Vasant for tea, so he could, in a sense, control their duration. After the tea, he had to contemplate the evening, but before it, he could doze a little, watch Tamzi's painting, or the lizards race across the wall to coagulate in a corner, listen to the music of Nazrul Islam or Vivaldi, daydream, fantasize, think of his past, reorganize it, try to force out of it a pattern, masturbate without joy, sometimes smoke some marijuana, read a little Marcus Aurelius, or just lie down and drink of the sun shriveling up the world outside. He liked the afternoons in his surreal, darkened room. He felt safe while to him the world burnt. When he opened the door for Vasant, the sun would have weakened a little and a few more hours would have elapsed in Madna. He spent many evenings at the collector's, but on some evenings he felt just too blown to go out. His eyes looked too red. He felt too alone to talk sanely to anyone. Then he would wait for sundown and go for a walk. The town was too dirty and too crowded, and there was always the risk of meeting someone from the office and the tedium of consequent small talk, so he usually walked away from the town, along the train tracks. On some nights he would listen to the 9 o'clock radio news. Earlier, he had generally avoided newspapers and what they called current affairs. News had never interested him, unless it had been calamitous, in which case it had got to him anyway. But in Madna he began to listen to the radio carefully, sometimes just to have another voice in the room. It became a major link, the only objective one, really, with the world beyond Madna. For the Bombay and Calcutta newspaper came in late and inevitably with stale news. In Madna, he also became aware of the power of radio to disseminate doctored information, for millions relied on it in micropolitan and rural India for entertainment and information, and more than half of them were illiterate. The radio said that 70% of the country would be covered by TV by the end of the year. Earlier, he would never have even heard such a remark, but now it registered, made sense. TV was coming to Madna too, Sati had said, and he could fully visualize its impact. It was much more powerful than radio, for it imprisoned the eye. Sati had added cynically that TV in Madna was an election stunt, and that made complete sense too. On most nights that he didn't eat with the collector, dinner was early, at about 8, because Vasant liked to sleep early. Then after dinner till about 4 in the morning, the insomnia. In Madna, he could never take sleep for granted. He would repeat the activities of the afternoon, thinking that for more than 20 years he had always slept well, except for 1 or 2 nights when excitement had kept him awake, like the night before the class picnic when he was 7, when he'd roamed around the house all night, overwrought because he'd been wearing his new jeans for the picnic. But in Madna, he seemed to have appalled sleep. When he finally dropped off, it was out of a weariness, even with despair. Thus he played out in one day one kind of life of the lonely